acceptance, or any of these things represented in moral qualities, honesty, humor, appreciation, compassion, forgiveness, understanding, any of these things fill the body with a different kind of expression that goes beyond all that fear-based stuff. And it allows an inclusion, even though it appears to be a threat.
Yeah, yeah.
And so if we can find a way to teach inclusiveness, and I think we're getting there. I think that we're on a progression of humanity that, if we look at it, we're really doing well. I mean, we look at all the trouble in the world, and yet there have never been this many representative democracies around the world and this few dictatorships. There's, as of 2003, 2003, that late, there are now no nations on earth that do not have laws against slavery. Now, it doesn't mean that slavery doesn't exist, but as of 11 years ago...
Blimey, was it that recent?
It was that recent.
The last country abolished slavery.
Yes, in 2003. There was finally a law in Mauritius.
Right, somewhere.
That said you can't own another human being. Okay, now it still exists. We know that slavery still exists. There's a human trafficking
Sadly
problem.
and tragically, yeah.
However,
there's still parts of the world that practice it.
We're becoming more aware of that. We're challenging our leaders more. I know it's not perfect yet, but it's a progression. And it's like you said, we're on a spiral.
Yeah, yeah.
So sometimes we say, oh, it's getting worse, but then it gets better than it ever has been. I mean, think about, people voting in this country. It was now, blacks got the right to vote before women did. That when our founding fathers in the United States said all men are created equal, they left out these black-skinned men and women. They left out women and all of it.
Yeah, yeah.
But they had the idea, and the consciousness was there, but then the practice of it had to catch up with that.
Sure, going back to what I was talking about Hegel earlier, I think he wrote at that time in the 1820s, and he talked about, the spirit of progress and how social institutions take a while to catch up with consciousness. Consciousness may recognise ontological equality between all people, but it takes a while for the political institutions to catch up.
Yeah. Well, that's why I have great hope.
Yeah. So I think maybe we can finish there. One last observation. We were excited here in Britain with Marianne Williamson running as a candidate for Congress, and you worked with her, didn't you, on that campaign?
Yes.
But she just announced...
I didn't work on the campaign.
You worked with her.
I worked with her for about a year and a half,
okay.
Helping to facilitate her lectures.
So she's a kind of a representative of new consciousness trying to get into politics, isn't she, in a sense?
Well, she's always felt that she's heavily influenced by Gandhi. Okay? And Gandhi, to her, illustrated that you can be both spiritual and political.
Right.
But I think the thing that she missed was that he was not a politician.
Right.
He was a spiritual leader.
Who stayed outside of political institutions.
Well, he stayed out of the political things, but he influenced people to understand that they could be dependent on each other rather than dependent on an overlord.
Don't you think Obama began with that vision? If you read Obama's life story, he began as an idealist. How do you feel in the States about his presidency? Do you think he's lived up to the hype?
I think there's a lot of disappointment.
Is there?
I think there's a lot of disappointment because...
What happened?
From my perspective, there's a lot of ideas that we don't want career politicians, we want to get them in and out and all that stuff, but unfortunately the structure in Washington, let's say if I got elected, I could be elected with this, or Marianne got elected with this idea that we're going to really change things, we're going to make a difference. But when we get in there, I'm an amateur when it comes to understanding things about power production, what powers this place, interstate travel, and how laws across states are affecting other places, how resources across state borders.
The legal system requires people to think in a certain way.
Well, not that it requires you to think that way, but I don't know anything about that. I would then have to rely on lobbyists, people who knew. Right. I would get my information from the Sierra Club and from the oil company. And then I would have to look at that and go, well, where is the balance?
Right.
And knowing that they have an agenda and I have an agenda, and I'm kind of leaning toward this agenda, but I have to take this into consideration. You know, and,
Right.
and especially when you think about military, why isn't Guantanamo? Why wasn't
Why wasn't it
Guantanamo
shut?
Bay
Which is
shut
Obama's
down?
point. Yeah,
Because the people in the Pentagon
Mm.
have been there a lot longer than any of these people who have served in office.
Mm.
You know, they're in there for a couple
So
of
they
terms.
tell the politicians how it works. Really.
Well, in a way, they you know it's such an entrenched
So
institution.
who can stand up? I mean, what we do in the Castle Hill, we have the Centre for Peace Policy Research. Now, in the States and in Britain, we have security policy, defence policy, foreign policy. We have loads of policy think tanks. This is the only place on the planet which is completely ridiculous, where we're doing peace policy research. How are we going to get peace on this planet if we don't plan for it, think it through? And it seems to me if we have enough thinking people networked together, thinking through a peace policy, you know, we'll get there. I mean, I'd like to invite you.
I agree that. I agree with that.
Yeah.
I think
Be part
though that
of
the
that.
way that has to happen is not through changing the political system in Washington. I refer to Washington
Sure.
because that's my system.
Right.
Because I think that is such an ingrained, corrupt thing that the only way to dislodge it is not by going into the corruption and trying to clean out the corruption, but by making the corruption irrelevant. And the way we can do that is by getting together on a local level. We have a way now through the internet to really truly be
Take power
local,
back to the
think
local.
globally but act locally.
Right.
When I used to be a poll worker, volunteer poll worker.
Okay.
And it's interesting because the presidential elections would come up and you would see a lot of people come to vote. And their vote becomes a drop in the bucket. And their vote also, most of the time, you find people voting against an opponent. Like
Right. So
there
it's
was
not positive voting; it's kind of negative.
there was Representative Kucinich,
Yeah.
who was I was voting
Peace-
for him all the
peace
way.
activist,
He was
great
a
man.
great
Yeah.
leader as far
Yeah.
as I was concerned. And so many people that I talked to in liberal California would say, "Oh yeah, I really like Kucinich, but he's unelectable." And the idea
Right.
that the press gave us, we would listen to the press, and the press would pretty much call the shots and decide where the interest was, and that interest would follow that kind of reasoning. And I said, well, he's only unelectable because you won't vote for him.
And you and you and you.
And yes, and people are afraid to throw their vote away because the other guy might get voted in. You know, so it's a voting of a lesser of two evils rather than voting. And I saw a theory. Now, in California, we just kind of dismantled our primary, or the way we do primaries. And if we can kind of rethink the way we do elections, it might change things. Somebody suggested instead of voting for A or B, or voting for one person and that person gets your vote, that there's a hierarchy of your votes. So let's say that
Right.
everybody gets 5 votes.
Like a list, yeah.
Yeah, and I give, you know, first vote to this person and my second vote to this person, right? Well, what if Kucinich was so many people's second vote
Yeah.
that he actually emerged?
I think
as a
that
leader?
is a system that's in use in some elections, even in this country. Single transferable list, I think it's called.
It
There
makes
is,
a lot
it's a
of
system
sense.
of, voting.
Right, because then you start to see that candidates that, you know, that are really popular actually maybe a little popular on both sides.
Sure.
And the other
can I
thing-
just
Yes, please.
interject something from a Druid perspective,
Yeah.
just very briefly, which is, much as I respect your views and your country, I think there's an over fetishization of democracy, as if it's the only game in town. And I think America has this tendency to go around the world imposing democracy on cultures which have other systems. In some other cultures, like Japan or the Middle East, and even Britain, which has still kept a monarchy, you know, don't forget it was a democratic vote that sentenced Socrates to death.
Right.
You know, democracies can also be quite brutal.
Well, hence
And-
why we have our
You know-
Bill of Rights, the addendum to the Constitution,
Right.
which
right.
George Mason wrote. And
Yeah, he was a clever
that-
man, George Mason.
Yeah, and he had the foresight to go, whoa, this is not done
Because you can
yet.
get an elected tyranny, as in
Right.
Nazi Germany. You know, that was
Right.
democratically elected.
Right.
So I think you need a check and a balance against the kind of hyperbole of democracy. Like in the Middle East, in Arab and Muslim countries, the Council of Elders, the Shura, has weight. You know, the people who've been around the block a long time. In ancient Rome, it was the Senate, people who had gravitas, and they weren't elected.
Yeah.
They were there
Right.
because of knowledge and expertise. And in Britain, we have the House of Lords, the aristocracy of, you know, by descent or by excellence. The word aristocrat means excellence. And
Well, can I share with you my vision of a political utopia?
Okay, go for it.
Okay. It all starts on the local level. What I was getting at with the elections is, you know, more people come to the presidential election, and we get these small local elections. And the small local elections, I get sometimes 10 votes
Right.
in a precinct of, you know, 60,000 people.
Right.
So it's like, and there the vote really counts. Because if your vote is 1 out of 10, you're making a big difference. You have a big say in things.
Sure.
Right? Now, if we could rearrange the way people think and really take democracy the way I think it was meant to be applied, in that in our community, let's say that we represent the castle and there are households in this area. So amongst ourselves, we say, well, Thomas, you know more about this than anything. Could you go represent us at the town hall?
Right.
And it isn't you going, come on, guys, I can do it. Come on, vote for me. I want to be the one.
No, it's kind of
It's
like
kind of thrust upon you.
yeah, yeah.
And so when we have our town council meeting to represent the town, and you represent the family, instead of you coming in saying, well, I want to be the one, it's a kind of, well, who are you putting up? Who are you putting up? Well, let's talk about this. And in the conversation, we realize who can best represent us.
Right.
We come to terms with what we really want to say in here and who can best do it. And that person may not want the job.
No, I think it might have been Plato who said that the problem with democracy is that the people who are best qualified to serve are the least likely to put themselves forward for office.
Right. But if